Welcome back to Silicon Bites. In this episode, we'll look at the Russian war economy. The crisis is here. Before we jump into it, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee. It is especially important at this time to help the channel if you can. We are planning our next series of events, the final events of this year. It includes a trip to Ukraine. And I have to be blunt, these things don't come free. They won't happen, in fact, without your help and assistance, as has your help proved to be absolutely crucial in all the events that we've run throughout the year. Now let's jump into the episode. In this one, we follow the money through Russia's war economy. Loyalist insiders are sounding the alarm. The central bank is stuck between inflation and a slump, and the budget is being patched with tax hikes and expensive borrowing. Is this the point where the soft flesh of Russian ambition meets the cold steel of capacity and reality? Or will Putin keep cranking the gears of war, seeking to attain ends that are impossible and thereby break the economy? Meanwhile, Ukraine keeps pounding Russia's energy system, one refinery at a time, feeding Russia's inflation and starving its logistics. Loyalists are now saying the quiet part out loud. A chorus of pro-system and pro-war voices inside Russia now concede the economy is on a downturn. The main point of contention is how far and how fast it will fall, and whether there is a bottom to this economic slide. A prominent business host on Tsargrad summarized October data with grim bullet points: layoffs, shorter work weeks, shrinking real wages, and even the defense adjacent sectors are starting to sag. Those are the commentator's words. He added that the composite leading indicator for recession has tripped its red line, pointing to a fall in real GDP in 2026. And this is Tsargrad. It's not a cozy liberal news channel, but a tub-thumping advocate for Russia's militaristic orthodox fascism, a version of OAN on steroids, full of hate, vitriol, loathing, and exhortations to ethnic violence. The consolidated leading indicator of a recession in the Russian economy has exceeded its critical threshold, said the commentator, signaling a high probability of a decline in the physical volume of GDP in 2026. Next, they wheeled on a factory director who reeled off hard activity gauges that the Kremlin cannot spin. Rail freight is down, industrial electricity consumption is down, bank payments turnover down 8%, and a visible shift to a 4-day week across many of the big industrial employers. Reuters document scoop from Russian railways in May showed cargo volumes running 6 to 9% below plan, and RZD, that is Russian Railways, trimming investment. By October, the carrier was cutting management jobs and forcing unpaid days off as demand sagged. That's according to Reuters. Ural Vagon Zavod, the rail, car, and tank manufacturing giant, confirmed a 4-day week for civilian staff, citing a steep fall in cargo volumes. That's according to Reuters. Next, the monetary vice, where 16.5% isn't any kind of relief at all. On the 24th of October, the Bank of Russia trimmed the key base rate 50 base points to 16.5%, calling it a cautious move, while admitting underlying price growth remains above target. This is the Central Bank of Russia quote. Reuters' read on this was blunt. It's a symbolic cut, with inflation still sticky after fuel and food price spikes. Inside the Duma, officials conceded what some voices have argued all year: the budget's oversized impulse on war spending, supercharging inflation. Finance Minister Anton Silvanov said the quiet part out loud. High rates are the consequence of last year's fiscal push, and a tax package is meant to cool that impulse. But these officials cannot articulate the real solution, even if they can indirectly flag the problem. The full-scale war created the conditions for this economic disaster, and only ending the war can start to ease the issues. At the coalface, Russian enterprises tell pollsters that all inputs are rising: materials, energy, and labour, squeezing margins and killing capex. July's manufacturing PMI data showed the fastest contraction since March 2022 and three-year low confidence. Again, that's from Reuters. So here's the 2026 budget math. Debt service up, taxes up. Russia's state debt interest bill jumps again in 2026 to roughly 3.9 to 4 trillion rubles, near 9% of federal spending, thanks to high yields. That's 10-year OFZs, greater than 15%. That squeezes room for anything that is not labelled guns in this budget. That's according to Reuters. The National Wealth Fund is a thin cushion. Siluanov also admitted that the liquid part of the NWF has shrunk to 4 trillion rubles. That is smaller than a typical annual budget deficit. He spelled it out in the hearings. About 4 trillion rubles are left, roughly 3 trillion unencumbered. See also Reuters May tally, where 3.3 trillion rubles liquid after a two-thirds drawdown on the National Wealth Fund since 2022. The VAT rise to 22% in 2026 is now paired with a phased tightening of VAT exemptions for small businesses after initial pushback. Moscow also plans to shrink simplified tax thresholds, measures that business lobbies call a shock that risks closures or a drift into the shadow economy. Again, Reuters quoting, "We cannot describe the Duma as a real opposition chamber, and any critique offered by members of the Russian parliament cannot stray into anti-war themes. Nonetheless, certain challenges or questions are being asked in a way that does not result in the member of parliament immediately being ushered towards a window in a tall building. In Duma exchanges captured on video, the MPs hammered the cabinet. You're raising taxes while keeping rates high and still projecting retail sales to jump to 8%. One MP said this is the strongest hit on small business in years." So here is the retail reality. Russians are starting to save and business margins are vanishing. Chains are offloading assets and warning that even grocery volumes are slipping as households flip to a savings mindset. Infoline Analytics now sees operating margins collapsing to 1.7 to 1.9% in 2025. This is a historic low, according to the Moscow Times. A consumer advocate in St. Petersburg quoted in recent video that was made by Michael Naki and Vladimir Milov, who we often track on these economic issues. They offered the street-level version of this analysis. Chicken is up 25% in 3 months. Pork and beef are elite products now. The perception of what is affordable has therefore changed dramatically for the average Russian, having an impact on consumer choices and lifestyles. How many, though, will connect it to the war, and how many will conclude the war must end? And we turn back to that story about 4-day weeks, Fridays off, and furloughs in industry. Reuters mapped 6 major industrial employers: cement, coal, railways, machinery, shifting to shorter weeks or furloughs to dodge mass layoffs. Sembros, which is a cement company, moved to a 4-day week, and RZT, the railway company mentioned earlier, imposed unpaid days off and now is implementing management cuts. Automakers Gaz, Kamaz and AvtoVAZ followed with reduced schedules. AvtoVAZ now plans a 4-day week throughout 2025. That's in Reuters. From the factory floor, a manager's verdict in the episode produced by Naki and Milov. Wages stopped growing and they're about to fall, he predicts. There are, of course, fuel strikes and inflation. The refinery war bites back, piling the pressure on Putin's economy. Ukraine's long-range drones have repeatedly knocked out refining capacity, forcing Russia to ration exports, import fuel from Belarus, and live with higher pump prices, all of which bleed into CPI and freight costs. Coverage of this issue varies by outlet, but the through line is absolutely clear. The Financial Times says that multiple refineries were hit since August. Diesel exports have reached multi-year lows. less than 1 million barrels per day. That is the hit that's been taken of capacity. That is the disruption that's been logged at peaks of interrupted oil flow. AP early this year, repeat hits on Volgograd and other plants. The Washington Post says that up to 40% of capacity is idled at times in the gas processing industry. Bans and rationing to protect domestic supply. We should use this with caution because, of course, these estimates change based on what's been fixed and based on the latest attacks mounted by Ukraine. But that's from the Washington Post. Refinery outages raise transport costs and fertilizer chemical prices. They also constrain Russia's military logistics that are huge drinkers of diesel. That helps explain why the central bank kept real rates punishing even after October's small cut. Again, Reuters. Sign-up money dries up. Regions cut contract bonuses. With budgets squeezed, regions are slashing enlistment payouts. The Moscow Times and local outlets tracked the steep cuts in Tatarstan from 2.7 million rubles to 400,000 rubles, with similar moves reported elsewhere. The headline: Russian regions are spending less on war recruits. That's the Moscow Times. See also the analysis tracing the spread of the 400 to 800,000 ruble caps that are being imposed. That was from the Eurasia Review. Various publications suggest the same trend line, listing Mari El, Chuvashia, Yamal, Nizhny Novgorod, Bashkortostan, all trimming payouts down below the 800k ruble cap. Commodities and the external squeeze. Russia's coal sector also is experiencing bad times. It's in its worst crisis in decades, loss-making and closing mines as rail tariffs rise and Asia demand underwhelms. The FT tallies 225 billion rubles in losses in the first 7 months of 2025, with dozens of firms at risk. That's according to the Financial Times. The IEA says that oil and fuel export revenues have been sliding amid lower prices and sanctions pressure. Discounts to Brent crude persist, and planned 2026 budget oil assumptions look optimistic, as senior Duma figures themselves have conceded in some of the recent debates. That's reported in Reuters. Duma heavyweight Alexander Zhukov warned that the budget assumes oil prices and volumes that are far too optimistic, with larger discounts likely having to be made on the sales of Russian crude. So Putin's policy bind: tighten his belt or risk the economy tanking. The Kremlin's 2026 blueprint relies on higher VAT, shrinking small business relief, and bigger domestic borrowing, but it yields that make debt service a top 3 line item, with defence and pensions as well. That's from Reuters. Inside the hearings, an MP laid out the contradiction. You want 8% retail growth while hitting SMEs and keeping rates sky high, and still promising industrial revival. Well, they are hinting that something doesn't add up. The central bank's own October press conference acknowledged elevated inflation expectations and accelerated lending, but not the kind of investment that leads to factories being built or a general lift in the economy. Firms say they are borrowing to cover working capital and roll over old debt, not build new infrastructure, new production lines, new products. This is the bottom line from officials themselves. After deliberately cooling the economy in 2025, 2026 will require deliberate stimulus just to hit the required 1.3% growth. This is a policy trap, which only ending the war can have a hope of breaking. But this is the one thing that Putin will not consider. We'd even argue cannot consider, as it would be a regime-ending move. So what will happen to Putin's war machine? In terms of manpower, there is lower sign-up money and shrinking regional budgets, harder, pricier recruitment that may well lead to fewer recruits. That's according to the Moscow Times. Fuel and mobility, refinery outages, rail bottlenecks, and high logistic costs ripple into frontline supply. That's according to the Financial Times. And industry, 4-day weeks in civilian divisions Investment pauses and PMI contraction point to plateauing war-adjacent output, says Reuters. And finally, finance. Debt service is crowding out other expenditures. The National Wealth Fund is growing increasingly threadbare, and tax rises are killing off growth. It is starting to stall despite the wartime boom from the military-industrial complex. Every indicator suggests that that is now over and is going into reverse. That's according to Reuters. Authoritarian economies can run hot on mobilization and on a war economy until they hit the cold steel wall of prices, parts, and payroll. This week, the wall has become visible even to Kremlin loyalists who have been assiduously trying to ignore it, to comply with the fantasy world of their tin pot, pint-sized Tsar, the emperor with no clothes. A cosplay Stalin reenacting an absurd fantasy version of World War II, scripted by someone who has never read a history book and barely even comprehended films about the Second World War that he may have watched. All these decisions by Putin will ultimately bring the Russian Empire to a crashing end, as well, we hope, we think, of Putin's regime and his life. Well, here are some of the concluding points from this economics-related episode. The war machine math, debt, VAT, refineries, and recruitment. The big picture keeps tightening. Higher debt service costs, a looming VAT hike, refinery outages from Ukrainian strikes, and thinner fiscal buffers. Put it together, it's the kind of structural squeeze that an authoritarian war economy can hide or mask for a while, up until it can't. There is debt servicing that is crowding out other cost line items. Reuters' latest budget read shows that debt servicing costs are rising 22 to 23% in 2026 to 8.8% of total spending. That is double 2021's share. The quote from that publication, debt servicing costs will rise by 22.5%. That is 8.8% of total budgetary expenditures. High rates aren't going away either. The Bank of Russia trimmed but kept the policy tight, cut the key base rate to 16.5% per annum, and that is still a terrible squeeze on business lending, while noting that inflation expectations still remain high. That's a brake on investment, and it hits SMEs with much higher costs. That is, figures at least from Central Bank of Russia. Taxes, the VAT ratchet. Moscow is pushing a VAT increase to 22% from 20% and phasing in tighter thresholds after SME pushback. As one economist put it, the tax pressure on small business is increasing massively. Businesses will be struggling to make revenue, let alone growth. They can forget about that. Then there are the reserves of the National Wealth Fund. It is a far thinner cushion than it was when the war started, and there are far fewer money taps that Putin can turn on. With the deficit drifting wider, Finance Minister Silovanov flagged fresh draws on the National Wealth Fund in May. The ministry is leaning on what's left of liquid assets to balance. That's a one-shot lever, not a growth plan, which means that as we go through 2026, many, many more harder choices are going to confront the Putin regime. Then there is the refinery war, logistics, and CPI pain. Ukraine's deep strike play keeps punching Russia's refineries. It is relentless. This week, Lukoil's Volgograd plant, a top tier one, halted operations after a long-range drone hit the CDU-5 and a hydrocracker. The quote from Reuters is, the Volgograd oil refinery ceased operations following a Ukrainian drone attack that chokes diesel and jet fuel output that the military needs, and it bleeds into transportation costs and inflation. AP's wrap of this adds a wider framing. Kiev is methodically targeting Russian energy infrastructure to disrupt Russia's war effort by cutting off oil revenues, as well, of course, as the refined oil products that Russia's war machine needs. So what are the implications for Putin's war machine? Well, the budget. There are more rubles to bondholders and paying in interest. There's less fiscal room for munitions, enlistment bounties, and social placation. The implications for industry are huge. High rates, VAT squeeze, capex, and working capital, just as defense suppliers need upgrades. The mini boom from the war economy is over, but there is no bandwidth for businesses to grow or deal with their debt problems. Then there is fuel and mobility. Refinery downtime raises logistics costs and availability risks for armies and rail. Volgograd is a case study with nationwide knock-on implications. Then there is the illusion of resilience. The National Wealth Fund tap buys time, not momentum. Each draw narrows that shock absorber down. In 2026, we are going to see it completely eliminated. Well, authoritarians can bluff with secrecy and slogans, and in the final recourse, they can use repression to paper over reality. But the above listed line items don't lie. Interest rates, taxes, outages, and dwindling rainy day jar. That's not a strong financial foundation as Russia enters the fourth year of its commitment to full-scale war against an adversary that remains completely resilient.